Snyder, welcome back to
Thank you, Travis. Great to be back.
Boom, it's good to see you.
Great to see you too. You give the best welcome of any podcast host ever. And I say that as a fellow podcast host, but your style, I got to emulate. It's like, welcome to my bourbon drinking session by the fireplace. It's great. It's great. Very convivial. Thank you.
Oh, and you really got me going. Maybe it's the cup.
You're red right now. Your whole face just turned red.
That doesn't happen very often. You embarrassed me. You embarrassed me. I don't know what else to
Are
do.
Moody grads allowed to drink bourbon? It just occurs to me I may have offended you.
I don't know. Yes, they do. Matter of fact, I had Malcolm Guide on the show, and he's like, "Can I drink on the show?" And he was smoking a pipe, and he was drinking a pint. I'm like,
I love it. Two bearded woodsmen who are silent, quiet poets.
Oh yeah,
smoking a pipe over Zoom. That's perfect.
It was just so funny. It was just so funny. Anyway, and it was St. Patrick's Day too, so that made it even worse.
Perfect.
It was like 9 o'clock his time, so I don't know if he remembers the interview. I shouldn't say that. It was a really good conversation. He had made some amazing stuff, but no, I'm not offended by that at all. But
okay.
Do you remember, and are you ready for the Fast Five?
I'm ready. Well, I'll just have to be ready. So go for it.
Now, I know that you went on vacation. And what was your most favorite meal on your vacation? Where was it?
So I have only really learned Romance languages throughout my life. And we went to the Czech Republic and Austria. And in the Czech Republic, it was my first time really around the Slavic languages. And I'm not going to remember, I found it very difficult, and I'm not going to remember the name of the restaurant, but I remember the subtext of the restaurant, which is bohem bourgeoisie, which was funny because my husband coined this word bobo, which is the same concept of these left-leaning upper middle class people. And we stumbled upon the sign and we were laughing, look at your impact. You've created this concept. And we decided to walk in there, and it was just the most amazing meal. And turns out it had a Michelin star, and it was the splurge of our vacation, but it was delicious. The textures, the flavors. I mean, I remember the raspberry sorbet at the end. I can't even remember it. At first, I get intimidated by the small, when food is small. I'm enough American. I really do like the overflowing fries. But when you're in Europe, you do as the Europeans do. And the presentation was beautiful, but it was just, I can't even explain it. The way they sauteed the mushrooms. I'm going to butcher this, but it was just, there was the right amount of garlic, the right amount of salt, the right amount of cumin. I mean, I'm a bit of a cook, so I kind of I just taste all the layers. I'm not snobby about it, but it was, and then the service, it felt like when you go to New York City, most of the waiters are way overqualified for what they're actually doing. And they're all, I think, acting on Broadway, and then they're paying the bills by waiting tables. And so they have this poise and shoulder posture, and they're running around the room. And I feel like in these New York City restaurants, they're all in they're doing a rehearsal for the play that night. They're all just in coordination. And this restaurant felt a bit like that, but these were true waiting table professionals. And it was a whole choreography. So that was just almost as delicious as the food.
Awesome. Yeah. I love that. You've made me hungry just by listening to
I wish I could remember the exact dish. The whole thing was too magical to reduce down to, I can't even remember the specifics, but yeah, it just left. It was one of those things where you're something as morally neutral as food really can be the reason to live. This is a highlight.
It's funny. You and I are both singers. So I remember a friend of mine, he was performing at a solo ensemble. And by the time he was a senior in this is high school, but he says by the time he was a senior, his goal was to make the judge put their pen down so that they could just marvel at it. And I think a chef has done their job, or a cook has done their job, when I just want to put my fork down, close my eyes, and savor the bite.
Yes, well said. Exactly.
Oh, so good. All right, here's your second question. Your favorite store to shop at in person is what?
Michael's Crafts.
My daughter was there. She just quit.
She just quit? Your daughter worked there?
Yeah, she
was. I can't imagine. Maybe their labor union isn't so great. I mean, I think
it's more of, you don't quit jobs, you quit bosses. That's what it is. But I know so many people that love Michael's. What do you craft?
It's more, I think, childhood nostalgia. When I was a kid, I was pretty crafty. I did a lot of, I'm so gonna geek out right now on being very G-rated. I did a lot of counter cross stitch, beading, collage work, and I'm not that artistic, or I don't feel I'm skilled artistically, but there's some, I would say as a kid, if I could go into a public library or Michael's Crafts, and then of course I like a candy store, that those three things are like my version of heaven. And I think so there's still that child in me. But when I go in, I don't know, I'm sort of surprised, A, that Michael's has lasted, and B, frankly, all the tiny little, I assume like family owned businesses that like create these random, like the sticker on a magnet or the construction. I think it's the colors, it's the raw ingredients that you can create something of your own with. I'm still a big fan and believer in homemade gifts. So that's just what pops into mind. I could spend quite a bit of time, not even buying much, just like curious who out there. It's like when you see a horror film in the opposite way, you're like, what person am I sitting next to on an airplane who is directing a movie this scary? Are these people out there? And that's in a bad way. At Michael's, I'm like, who are these business people that are creating these most random little flower petals? And for what? They just trust in the human ingenious spirit. So
that's a very interesting way of looking at it. I've never even thought of it. I mean, the horror film stuff, I'm like, these people need help.
Don't you feel that way? I know there's like very sophisticated movie critics who I like and admire who love horror films as a genre, and they think it tells us something about the redemption of the universe, but I find it pretty depraved.
Yeah, I'm with you in that regard. I've never been a horror film person. I do like the kind that those more the black and whites where they don't do a lot of scary stuff, but it's how they use silence and lighting and music and how they bring you into the story. That's a little bit different, but even then,
like a Hitchcock kind of. Yeah, I agree. Like The Birds. That's kind of I don't know if you ever saw that old black and white where the birds come and the birds are the bad characters.
I know the story. I've just never seen it. I don't like birds.
Yeah. Well, this will make you like them even less.
I don't like stuff. I don't like those films where it makes me think of stuff that's going to attack me. Like when I was a kid, my mother watched this movie, and I just looked it up the other day. It was it was on PBS, and it was of this killer doll, this Amazonian doll that
the dolls.
I was so scared. I ran into the back room with my mom. I
never even saw those movies, but I remember going into remember those when we had VHS, the movie rental stores, and like all the horror section when you would just like race by that aisle were all movies about dolls. I think there was one called there's a famous doll who's really scary. I won't remember it, but
Chucky?
Just yes. Oh. And like just being actually in the Czech Republic, we were going to all these little medieval towns in these mountains, and they had like doll shops. I guess the Czechs love dolls, and I didn't want to go in for that reason. I was like, they're staring at me. Why are their faces so porcelain? They're about to crack into blood.
Somebody posted a photo on Facebook. It was in some dad group, and he goes, my daughter gave away her toys to like the Goodwill. He goes, and I took one of the dolls and then I set it right outside of her bedroom window facing it. The next day, like the doll came back. So when she opened up her window, she's
that scream would be blood curdling. No, thank you.
Oh, that's funny.
No, thank you.
Anyway, all right. Next question. Because you are a singer.
Shower singer. Yeah.
Well, that's the question here. So the best song to belt out in the car when no one is around or with friends is what and why? Or musical. You can pick a musical too.
Well, I'm sorry. My long-term memory has gotten worse and worse. And so I'm just going with the moment right now because I just got back from Austria. I like literally every minute I'm just singing The Hills Are Alive. I'm just walking around waiting for my little Austrian dress and Maria von Trapp to pop out, and no apologies.
So let's see. Julie Andrews, what year?
Julie Andrews, 19. The film, I think, came out in 61, maybe 64. We could look that up, but kind of right before the real part of the 60s began.
So you can sing it?
Well, I'm not going to do it right now.
Oh, come on!
No.
I'll do it. The hills are alive with the sound of music. Sorry, I studied musical theater. That's what I was going to go into, and then God has
Oh,
humor and put me into pastoral ministry.
well, there is a
Oh,
related like performance piece. And what do you have a favorite musical?
it started off in the '80s, so of course, like Les Mis, and it's become cliche now, almost kitsch. But I always loved Phantom of the Opera. There's some that I enjoyed just because of the musical pieces, like Shenandoah had some really
Mm.
cool musical pieces. Um, but I used to sing a lot of stuff. Like I was actually in a show choir. If we're going to get fully open here. So I remember even choreographing some songs that we did to Les Mis.
Wow.
So that was a lot of fun. It is actually one of my most embarrassing moments too, because I was singing Empty Chairs at Empty Tables. I think that's what it was.
Ooh.
And it was early on. I think I was a sophomore, and I was always told when you're singing a solo, if you get feedback, pull the mic back, right? So I kept getting more and more feedback, and by the time I ended, I think the microphone was down by my hip, and it was because I didn't adjust. I was young,
Yeah.
It's one of those things where you're like, well, that learn from that. But there's so many musicals. I like the Music Man, or no, is the Music Man not Music Man? Yeah, Music Man.
Music
And
Man. Yeah.
what's the new one? What's not new anymore? The one that Hugh Jackman did. What was
Not
that?
La La Land.
No, no,
No.
no. He didn't do La La Land. He did where he did it with Zac Efron
Oh,
and
High School Musical?
no, not
Okay. That we
High
really
School
wanting.
Musical. Come on.
I think Zac Efron was in that, right?
He was, but he did
Okay.
something else after that. Now you made me have to look it up. I mean,
I
he,
was just before this podcast because I'm just coming back from vacation. I had this like High School Musical song pop in, like "Get your head in the game, get you."
what
So
is the name of the show? Because he's such a great singer, and we have very similar vocal range. So I can't. I'm trying to find it. It's uh, look at this song. It's gonna drive me crazy. I know I'm gonna think of it. The Greatest Showman. There it
Oh,
is.
The Greatest Showman. There you go. Did
That's a
you have
great.
heartbreak when Shanae O'Connor, this is less musical theater, when she died last week?
I
Or were
did,
you
and it's
never
gonna
a
be
big,
coming.
yeah.
But Sinead, I had Nothing Compares to You in my head. I remember watching Saturday Night Live when she tore up the
The
Pope
Pope?
photo, and I remember going, "That doesn't seem good." I didn't know
Yeah.
what was going on, but I'm like, I don't think that's a good thing. Everybody's
Yeah.
freaking out.
Yeah. I know.
But
And so I was just like reading more about her life. I kind of sensed she was a bit of a rat. I grew up on her music. Like that was my childhood in many ways, which is interesting because yeah. But I was like, oh, either the issues haven't changed, but like all the things she was reacting against feel like exactly 2023.
yeah,
Like she was at either ahead of her time or nothing has changed. And we're still in that same 40, 50-year era of like discontent and yeah, wrestling.
that frustration, angst, everything else. But
Mm-hmm.
okay, well, here's the next question. Number 4, the best writer you have ever read is who and why?
Oh gosh. Well, first person who popped into my head is living Christian Wyman. The poet he's at Yale. He wrote My Bright Abyss, and he ran Poetry Magazine for a while. He would in fact, he would be wonderful on this podcast. He would know
Really?
Malcolm Guite well. Yeah, Chris Wyman. He goes by Chris. He's struggled with a very rare form of cancer for about 10, 12 years, and he kind of writes out of that place. But his book, My Bright Abyss, is one of those, it's very difficult to summarize and describe, but it's sort of in a gorgeous way, like stunningly beautiful prose, gets at the ephemeral sensations of faith. And he's kind of been a gateway to, I think, very starved secular readers who are, I think, hungry for an experience of God, don't love doctrinal baggage, but are sort of open to the sensations of prayer and listening and all that. So he's the first who pops in my head just because I just wish I could construct sentences like him. But I'm sure there are many others, and there may be one who's even more, who I would say, boom, this, like, I want to write like them. I could never write like Chris.
I'm amazed at the ability of poets just to go about their job and do it so well and so frequently. Even
I
reading
know.
Height, he would just come up with these poems and put them online, and Of course,
Yeah,
imagination is just drawn into the heavenlies, and it's like, wow, how do you do that? It's just a
I
gift.
know. It is a
It's a gift.
gift.
All right, here's your last question, although I think you've kind of already answered it in various ways, but we'll ask it anyway. One thing that very few people know about me is what and why?
Oh dear.
Besides the Julie Andrews, the doll phase, the
Yeah.
sewing. We've learned a
Uh,
lot today, Anne. We've learned a lot.
well, I think probably people who read me know this, but it's just the first thing that comes to mind. I grew up in Hong Kong and Australia, and that is like has always set me a little outside American footing. I still feel like a student of this country that I'm meant to be serving through my work, and it remains a perplexing nation to me. I think just because of a childhood that wasn't here.
I do find that many of the people that were born outside of the country have some of the greatest insights into the country.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm not sure I'm Tocqueville here, but thank you for that. I will allow my shoulders to rise up a bit.
On that note, let's talk a little bit. The last time we met, I mean, we of course know that you are an editor and the editor
Yes.
of Comment Magazine, and you've been writing about charting social change.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of change going on in our culture right now. That's not a secret to anyone. Some, this is a welcome thing, and to many others, there's a great deal of fear. But why is it imperative for us to really chart social change, and what do we hope to learn from that?
Yeah, I don't know if I want to go so far as to say it's imperative. I run a magazine, and so we explore things that are curious to us. And the sort of genesis for we actually did something unusual. We spent 2 whole issues, which is basically 6 months of the year, in various forms in the magazine, through podcasts, through events, just trying to understand this whole phenomenon of how social change happens. Not we know change happens, like we're about to enter this perhaps whole new era of AI coming down the pike. And I think the more I'm learning about it, I'm finally taking seriously, like this could actually be quite a momentous shift. It may not be, but I think it's more likely this than even social media was, or than even parts of the Industrial Revolution. Or so we know, things change from advances in technology, natural disaster, swells in immigration. Like you can look at societal shifts based upon those kinds of moves that are more incurred either by crisis or war or invention. But I was interested in specifically like movements and movements that shift the norms in a society over centuries. And I don't know if it's imperative specifically for people of faith to think about that or explore it, but I do think there is something about when you pray the Lord's Prayer and you say, you ask, like, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, that is a line that is asking for some level of co-creation with God in the redeeming of his world. So I'm interested in these like inflection points that we can look back on and say, what was going on when suddenly everyone decided that, or not suddenly, but over time, everyone decided that slavery was an abominable evil. Like when before that, churchgoers and Bible scholars were often using those texts to support it, just as an example. Or what was going on when people decided, I'm always interested in the rehumanization missions, like what was going on when like women were suddenly given greater equality. And it was actually, a side note, interesting, just being in the Czech Republic, I went to the Museum of Communism, and they begin at the end of World War II as they take you through the sequence of Stalin and Mao. And in the early years, like here we know, like, oh, communism in its actual reality has been so bad. But as you begin and you sort of see these post-Hitler, post-fascist era, you see the propaganda posters. And I was like, oh, everyone looks so happy in these posters. I probably would have been drawn into this. The women are so equal to men, like women were brought in. Like it was interesting just to be like, well, there's different forces that are often modeled morally in terms of what they yield over the long term of history. And I think God can use all of our misguided visions of reality and visions of the future. So I think the reason to care about social change is as a Christian, to be to sort of take seriously our stewardship of the world and our stewardship of history, and believe that somehow like God works through grand sweeps as much as the small. And we were interested in exploring both the huge and the small, the public and the private, the hidden and the public activism, moral change versus legal change. The second like large point to make is that my and our interest in social change in a funny sort of way is equivalent to an interest in coherence. Like, what is cohering our world and specifically in the West, like our society? And I think I have felt in my own lifetime that when I read Letter from a Birmingham Jail and I study like all the different like local ways in the Deep South where you are that wound up like unfurling into this civil rights movement and sort of the genesis of that earlier in the century, and I'm like so moved. And I think the Christian in me is deeply moved because I see this like many becoming one, and I see conversions of heart and mind. And I see people who had long been victimized stepping up to the plate and self-sacrificing to lead and be patient and be gracious. And there was this like movement that ultimately I would say that's like some move of the spirit was happening through courageous people and strategic coordination. And it felt like it created a sea wave in shifting a nation. So now to be called a racist is to be considered is like one of the worst things you could be called. Mm-hmm. And why does it feel like movements since then that have been hashtagged out on Twitter, that have been Occupy Wall Street, that have been Black Lives Matter, that have been Me Too, like these various things that like rise up in the public consciousness and in our media, why does it feel like while many of them begin from a worthy place, they tend to fracture our society months later or a year or two later? They don't create this like permanent groundswell that leads to greater justice, that leads to a shalom. They tend to just like wind up, they enter into a tribalized era, and people are not converted, they're hard-hearted. And so I think out of my own frustration with the sense of, on the one hand, to your point, there is so much technological change. It feels like life is going faster than ever. Time is just, we can't keep up with it. We're all overwhelmed. We all feel isolated somehow as we're doing our best. But it's just, there's not a sense of like one national, with of course fractious and debate, we can always have that, but there's not a sense of like a coherent move together towards a new day, even a little iterative new day. All of that is largely driven by Silicon Valley. Like the united moves are driven by technology, not by like a positive vision of the good that is shared. So out of that frustration of like stuckness and disintegration was just this question of like, could we ever see? I mean, that's why I was so moved by watching, again, this is as a person of faith, but I was just really moved by watching what happened at Asbury earlier this year, and that outpouring of just like, I do think like ultimately there's something charismatic that needs to happen, and a movement of the Spirit of God that stirs us. And it's not about elites, and it's not about human pride and credit. Like there's something that is instigated by God himself in ways that are mysterious, but can we set the conditions to listen and respond? And the jury's out on, what that outpouring, if, what has happened. And I think probably a lot of things have changed at quiet, hidden levels that's not covered in any media story. Mm-hmm. But I still haven't seen like institutional coordination or health prepared to respond to that kind of awakening. But I was given so much hope by watching that largely on YouTube, because it felt like, okay, people are getting to the end of themselves. This is a community of people I'm watching humble themselves and like begin from a place of like personal confession. And that seems to be the healthiest place to begin, to whether it's confessing Christian nationalism or whatever. And it's a desire for people to take their responsibility as stewards of thy kingdom come seriously. And it's also a yearning for coherence.
Which is not easy to do. You talk about the Spirit of God at the end of the day is who is the one who must bring revival, a deep transformation in those deep structures of culture. I remember I was going back and forth in an email thread with James Davison Hunter about those very things. And it's not easy to generate that. On one level, we say, hey, this can happen. And we see these these whispers of it, these little they're being whispered about, and you do want to see it. And I like everyone else marveled. I couldn't believe how many people jumped on it to knock it down.
I know. Unfortunately, I sort of could believe it, but because I was initially skeptical. I mean, I have a charismatic strand to my spirituality, so I'm always open, but I wasn't sure at first. I was hearing rumors of it. And then finally I just like encountered it. A friend of mine went, took a video, and I just like watched it, experienced it directly, albeit through a screen. And I was very moved, like spiritually. I just like the Holy Spirit was like, this is real. Something really real is happening. And then you watch like the guys, the Gospel Coalition, and like the Doug Wilsons of, I don't know Doug Wilson himself, but like that type. I'm naming names just to name names. Like just are like, this is emotive. And yeah, my first reaction, I was very angry and annoyed. And then I just, it's not surprising. But it is interesting who those critiques come from. And it's like, why have we so lost the expectation for God to show up in a burning bush? Something about that feels like a major, what's the word I'm looking for? Not challenge to, but critique of, I'm missing the word here. We should be ashamed of our lack of preparation.
It's interesting you mentioned that. I was having a chat with Jamie Staples. She runs a ministry to Muslim women in trauma called the Truth Collective. And she was talking about some of the women in their Bible studies. She's going to kill me because I know she listens to the show. So I make sure I got to get this story straight, or she's going to be texting me going, you missed it. You messed it up. But she was talking about the difference between Western women and women from majority world cultures. And she goes, Western women know how to do a Bible study. She said they know how to study words. They know how to answer the questions. It's easy for them. Whereas the women in majority world cultures are less familiar with that and know how to go about it. But if you ask a Western woman, has she heard from God? She doesn't have the ability to say yes or no. I mean, she really just doesn't know how to answer. She doesn't know how to encounter God. And now, again, I know that some of my very reformed and cessationist friends are like, hey, no, we have the word. Yes, I agree. We have the word. But God speaks through his word and speaks to our hearts and realities where it's him or it's not. I mean, we're getting into deeper waters right now. But she said those women from majority world cultures don't have a problem hearing from God, whereas the women in the Western world very much do.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you saw the statistics. I can't remember if it was Pew or where the data came from, but it was talking about the decrease in denominations in the United States. And every single denomination decreased but two. The Presbyterian Church in America had a huge jump. And I'm going to attribute that to a lot of factors, no less being Tim Keller, just bringing awareness to PCA and just showing the intellectual and cultural ability to interact. But the other one was the Assemblies of God. And that's not a surprise when you look at it globally, especially as we become more multicultural and you see majority world cultures. Now, there's error in that as well. And that's what I find my friends are so quick to point out, that there is error, and I'm not denying that. But there's also a lot of good. Yeah. And there's a corrective that I think is going on. Just to answer your point of how we can't hear.
Yeah.
And I think if we interact with some of our brothers and sisters and learn to hear.
Yeah.
I mean, even when I started off in pastoral ministry, there were prayer meetings and people seeking God. And I don't see those very often anymore.
No. Yeah. No, it's like being open to silence. I mean, and it's what's funny is there's often like high liturgical traditions that do actually understand the structures for this, they understand the structures of what I would almost call like spiritual pregnancy in a community. Like, how do you wait and expect and prepare and hear? But then sometimes the high liturgical traditions also lack other spiritual muscles. You just said something, I happen to be in a moment of agonizing over kind of updating Comment Magazine's manifesto, like just sort of who are we, what do we believe, and what is the story we're inhabiting and trying to pick up and run forward with, and sort of a 2,000-year relay race of this Christian social thought tradition. And one thing I'm thinking of emphasizing is, though we are a magazine, so therefore we are an organ of words and arguments and imagination through words and hopefully images and art. We believe in beauty very much. But it's just this notion of different ways of knowing. Like, we really believe in different ways of knowing. And that is as much I think, majority world versus Western world, if you want to divide the world into those two categories, a thing as it is, of course, men and women. And, it's very fascinating if you spend a lot of time in Black churches or certain kinds of immigrant churches in the US versus like a PCA church in Nashville, or that there are different ways of, like, I think what's so fascinating about Jesus is he could sort of do it all. Like, he could argue up here, but there was something in his eyes that if you were deaf but not blind, you understood you were encountering God. And I think about, why is it that I always tear up when I hear someone with Down syndrome, or someone who has a huge stuttering problem, or who is brain damaged, or who's a quadriplegic, get up in a church and read a passage of scripture. That's like, for me, there's something that they know and that they see that I, and all my, like, quote, able-bodied and like mentally like sound working, or whatever the right word is, like, get tripped up by. There's like an intimacy they have that is somehow rooted in like apparent sort of weakness. And there's other ways of knowing outside of the brain. And thankfully, I mean, I think psychology today helps us out. There's a reason, like, The Body Keeps the Score was such a bestseller a couple of years ago. I think we are opening up in the West to non-cognitive 18 inches down, other ways of knowing. And even, like, actually, I'm sure Hebrew scholars would have beautiful seminars on the word to know, and like all the different ways, what that actually has meant biblically and throughout the globe over history. But it's something about that actually feels very crucial to perhaps even this question of social change.
There are so many questions that even come with that as we're talking about the Spirit of God working within these institutional factors. It's usually, as you mentioned earlier, we see oftentimes a split. People go to one camp or the other, and they can't keep that nuance and tension. But we do see that there are rhythms to, and you've already alluded to this, there are rhythms to life, there are rhythms to our culture, and sometimes there is a coalescence of spiritual factors. But there are these also generational shifts. You could map them out. I mean, no, you and I are both familiar with like the fourth turning. How do we discern what is spiritual, just simply generational, and just simply charting the cycle of human development or movement? How do you differentiate between that? Or do you? Maybe I'm asking you too big of a question. Maybe we need to ask someone else that. I know we talked about this beforehand, and you're like, ask the Pope.
What's actually funny, I can just share this because it's a kind of a fun story. I once in a while get a little courage, and I go for like the big dogs, and as we like seek certain kinds of thinkers to contribute to our magazine. And I don't have any direct line to Pope Francis, but I know someone who knows him, and I asked that person, Catholic, who's like super involved in the upper echelons of the Vatican. I was like, any chance, like, I have this pitch that's basically that question. We're doing an issue this winter. It's simply called Church, Where Are You? Or Church, Who Are You? Which is a little unique for us to sort of turn our lens on our own people and look inward in some ways. But I wanted a global piece. I wanted someone who was spiritually discerning and kind of would understand like how the Spirit of God is moving through Latin America and Asia and Africa and the West and Europe and North America, and yet who also has deep institutional responsibility. And this person was so sweet, wrote back like a week later and was like, Pope Francis is ill right now, and I'm not like, can you tell me more about like how you see him answering the question? And I'm happy to try, but it's just, anyway, I was like, oh, he's actually considering this. So I don't think we're going to get the Pope, but I say that to say it is too big of a question for me. And I go back and forth. When I started out in my 20s, this was in the early, sort of the Bush era. And then Obama was like whispered on everyone's tongues as this like hope, and something about that era, like 2006 to 2008, I had this audacious like instinct. I was like, I need to start, and I'm so glad I didn't do this, but I was shopping it around. I was like, I should start like a little nonprofit that's studying millennials, because I think millennials are the canary in the coal mine of all of our social changes. I'm so glad I didn't do it. But I was really interested in generations. And yet I've talked to so many people who are skeptical, like people I respect, historians, sociologists, who and even the fourth turning is a little debatable, like who kind of I've gotten more insecure around like what is a generation actually, and I think there is something to be said for like how generational differences are shifting. When they used to be, you could call a generation 60 years, then it was, if we're just looking at a lifespan, then it's 20 years, like parent child. And now it's like, I talk to Gen Zers, and within Gen Z, it feels like already there's 3 generations. Like the 26-year-old is super different than the 23-year-old is super different than the 20-year-old. And so there's something shrinking in terms of, if I could define a generation by mores, vocabulary, and norms, that makes sense to me. So all that's just to say, I think between the spiritual generational and then the sort of psychological development, human development cycle of human maturity and maturation, it's like a melange. It's all, I don't know how to exactly differentiate between. So I'm not answering it is a coalescence, and I'm going to need someone much smarter than me to kind of divide it out as a pie.
Well, even then, I don't know, as you said before, I'm not sure if any of us know exactly how to chart it out. Even if we brought in Mark Knoll or David Bevington, I'm sure that they would have
Peter Berger. Yeah.
I mean, all of these guys would have their own theories on exactly how it plays out. My question though is, as I do see the generations age, there's always some type of difference between generations, but there are similarities as well. I want to know what the practices of spiritual formation and catechesis are, so that we can help our children be faithful no matter what generational turn comes along. As a person who is seeking to renew the institution, what role does the institution play in our understanding of spiritual formation at the social level? Now, I know that's not one of the questions we've talked about beforehand. Normally we talk a little bit about that, but I'm just curious. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, because I've just, sorry to keep referring to this little week-long vacation, but just going to, I think going from the Czech Republic, where I was like thinking about World War II and then communism, and then going to Austria, where I was like unapologetically like going to every Sound of Music pasture that I could. And then reading, I was like, I think I had read it years ago, but I'm rereading the autobiography of Maria von Trapp. And I'm always that sort of generation of those like World War II, like frankly, the few, like shockingly few, disappointingly few Christians, European Christians during the Holocaust who were helpful and heroic. I have just always loved those books and those memoirs. And I've been just meditating on why is it, you talk to some of my Jewish friends in the US, and they'll say, most of us sort of know that it was really only the Christians in the Netherlands that, and a few of them at that, who were helpful to us. Everyone else like sold out. And as I've been meditating on just the last few days, like what was going on in the churches or other perhaps institutions and neighborhoods in the Dutch context specifically that didn't exist in other countries as Hitler was taking over. And there's obviously you have the Confessing Church in Germany. There's a wonderful book that's sort of an unusual biography of Bonhoeffer by a friend of mine named Laura Fabrici, that I highly recommend, called Bonhoeffer's House. And she spent years, her husband was a diplomat in Berlin, and she spent years just being a tour guide at Bonhoeffer's house. So it's less a book about like celebrating all of his public individual heroism and more looking at the quiet fabric of his life, like what was going on in the creedal and church rituals, what was going on in his daily dinner table growing up as a kid, what were the songs, what were his artistic rituals, obviously like even like what did the home indoor and outdoor life look like? And it's sort of like looking at the actual atmosphere and the environment that shapes us, and that led to these I think someone can be anointed and someone can be called, but there's also these like helpful sociological, atmospheric, formative nudges in our lives that are often institutionally rendered and granted to us. So that's a long wind-up to answer your question, but today, I think to use this, I actually had to look up this word, the counter catechesis. I was like, why are we doing counter catechesis? Don't we just need more catechesis? And I guess Tim Keller used it at some point, and maybe others have. And I guess it means how to do this, how to do like deep formation when all the forces in modernity and in a broader, largely, secular mainstream culture are tempting you in another way. And I would say just a few things. I mean, I think historically, like say in the 90s and early 2000s and like the Dobson era, and now I'm going to turn to the US context, like, there's a lot of focus on the right content and the right values and not exposing your kids to certain kind of films and certain kinds of music and so on. Then, of course, a lot of that got channeled into certain kinds of political action. And there were aspects to that, that I'm sympathetic to. But I think the older I get, and I'm not alone here, this is something about the challenges of our particular time, largely because of technology, the pace of life, sort of eroded social fabric, eroded local community life, thin social moral life, all of that is, I think, has accelerated over the last 20 years, us spending way more time on screens than with real flesh and blood people or with the earth. There's something about raising a family that is oriented around shared rituals and time, that is oriented around the creative, and like really compartmentalizing when the devices are out, that is sort of like pushing back against consumerist, passive, withdrawing activities where the home itself models, in some ways is like a mini church, like models deep engagement with one another, full presence, creative joy, mischief, humor. And I do think and I'm not trying to idolize the nuclear family here, but I do think there's something profound about literally being born into a mini little world that is highly engaged, humanly speaking, that is a form of counter catechesis insofar as once you've tasted the fine wine of that daily intensity in a household, then so much of a broader, disengaged, cynical, suspicious, solitary, frankly, all the dynamics that wind up leading in the extreme to mass shooters, all of that is seen for the thin gruel that it is. And your appetites are so, I think, exploded as a baby, young child, teenager. And of course, that family interacting in the broader culture, hopefully in ways that are deft and you're not overly sheltering your kids. I mean, all of that is, I'm not the one to give parenting advice here, but I think that it's in some ways it's more about rhythms and atmosphere and sort of wholesomeness early on and deep human engagement that feels like the counter catechesis we need. And I've wondered, I mean, there's obviously homeschooling is exploding right now, largely post-COVID, as and not just amongst people of faith, but I've been very curious, like how will families of faith that because of their faith are creating mini ecologies for kids to not be thrown into the sea of competitive comparison online and all the stuff that happens on social media. Like, how will those kids grow up to perhaps to be the leaders and be better equipped to be the kinds of leaders that the country needs, in ways that even if you're gunning for Harvard, but you grow up in a household that is allowing you free reign online and allowing you to, or they're overly meritocratically pushing you into a million scheduled extracurriculars. I don't know, like there's just, I think we're in an interesting moment where if a family takes like the call of love seriously in child formation, those people may wind up being the ones that we look to in 30 years in a way we're not going to be looking to others who have maybe the pedigreed formation, but not the like deeply loving fleshly formation.
I enjoy this conversation. I enjoy every time that we get a chance, an opportunity to talk. But once again, we have lost our time. As you said before, we're under the tyranny of the schedule and the tyranny of the urgent. But I think that your comments are extremely insightful into where our culture is right now and the need for this deep spiritual formation that in some ways is not really new. I even think back
It's
to,
ancient.
it is very
Yeah,
ancient. I mean, even with the nation of Israel practicing Sabbath, that carved out
exactly.
time.
Shabbat.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
all of those different things. But once again, you're going to have to come back again because we have to actually finish a conversation. I think I got through like,
Travis.
it's my fault. I totally am
No,
the
it's
worst
my
host.
fault too. No, you're
I
the
mean,
best
we
host.
get
Thank you for making this
talking.
feel so natural. I really, it's such a gift. It's a gift to your listeners. I feel like everyone loves eavesdropping on a conversation that's happening naturally, and you allow that to occur. So thank you.
You're gonna make me blush again, and stop it. I'm gonna start blushing again. I do want to get into some more of what you're doing with comment. I mean, we only got through maybe a quarter of our questions today, but there is just so much to talk about.
Here is, yeah, there is so much to talk about, and we, like you, are maybe becoming a bit of an 8-headed beast instead of a 1-headed beast. So and that's, I mean, I think I feel very kindred spirit with what you all are doing at Apollos Watered, and I hope it's an exciting time to trying to be doing what we can, maybe upstream, to provide this like canopy of a different way of engaging our broader culture, of being a social witness, of thinking about, say, the relationship between prayer and our public life. And I mean, I think there's something really interesting happening in the realm of spiritual formation, public witness, believing in institutions, but also believing in the Jesus way and the organic metaphors. And I think a bunch of us are in that turf, whether we're in the thought world or we're doing social service work on the ground. And I'm just really grateful you guys exist, and we can maybe be arm in arm somehow, even if we just wave across the miles.
I would love that. We'll see what God does. But I know you've
Yeah.
got a hard stop. We hate to end our conversation, but in that line, and since you're in Julie Andrews mode, we want you to sing "So long, farewell, Auf Wiedersehen, good night."
So long, farewell. May I taste my first champagne? Yes. No. From bourbon to champagne, we just got a little classier, full circle.
All right, Anne, thank you for coming
Thank
on.
you, Travis.
Flattered.
Okay, bye.